Help give kids an extra life by donating today to help sick and injured children. Link in the description and pinned comment below.
Alright, it's Tuesday night. I have no date, a 2-liter bottle of Fanta, and my All Rush mixtape. Let's rock. What? I couldn't find Shasta anywhere. Do you hear that sound? A simple repeating loop of 4 descending bass notes. But for the people who know the early days of the arcade, those notes are the sound of inevitability. The sound of an obsession. The sound of the relentless march of an unending force of extraterrestrial forces descending upon the planet. This is the legend of Space Invaders, one of the first wildly successful arcade games in history. Certain games define generations, from retro classics such as Super Mario, Sonic the Hedgehog, and the original Doom, to more modern mainstays like COD 4, Minecraft, and Futnut. But before all of that, there was Space Invaders, one of the first games to enter the mass public consciousness, and one that remains to this very day. And let me tell you, there was damn good reason for that. Its deceptive simplicity made for an incredibly addictive game that helped shape the future of the fledgling medium in more ways than one. And 45 years later, to the month, it's still regarded as legendary and is honored in many ways. And it was only a matter of time before I got to this one. In fact, I'm surprised it took me this long. Well, time for me to remedy that. Let's look at the development, success, and legacy of Taito's biggest icon. Yup, we're back to Taito again, and it's their 70th anniversary this year as well. Funny that. Space Invaders was the most notable work of Tomohiro Nishikado, who was a developer for Taito at the time. He began development of the game in 1977, a year after the release of Atari's Breakout, which he cited as one of the main inspirations for the game. He wanted to take the feeling of satisfaction that resulted from destroying obstacles one at a time and apply it to the likes of target shooting games, using projectiles to destroy moving targets. He also wanted those targets to be able to fire back and create a situation where a game over would result from losing lives instead of running out of time, which was the norm during that early era. The aliens themselves weren't even the original idea. Early enemy ideas included warplanes, tanks, and battleships, but Nishikado found it difficult to simulate the movements of such enemies at the time. Humanoids were easier to animate, but remember what I said about Death Race in a previous video? That shit wasn't gonna fly. Inspiration struck with sci-fi features including the 1974 anime Space Battleship Yamato, H.G. Wells' classic novel War of the Worlds, and of course, Star Wars. The novel in particular inspired the design of the invaders, with the octopus-like aliens being the basis for the other designs somewhat resembling marine life. The game spent a year in development between the software and the hardware it ran on. The game used an Intel 8080 CPU, displayed raster graphics on a CRT monitor, and created sound using a combination of analog circuitry and a Texas Instruments SN76477 sound chip. The idea for a microprocessor came from 1975's Gunfight, which, funny enough, was an adaptation by Midway from one of Nishikado's older games, Western Gun. Time really is a flat circle. Space Invaders originally released in both upright and tabletop versions in April of 1978 in Japan, with Midway licensing the game for release in North America in November of that same year. So let's pop a quarter in the slot and start this relic up. The game's so old that calling it a baby feels wrong, you know. By now, I'm sure at least some of you know this setup, and if you don't, please don't tell me in the comments because I don't need a reminder of how old I am. You start with a laser which can fire one shot at a time, mounted on a moving base behind a set of 4 barricades, while they start in a formation and march from left to right, firing back at you and descending a line towards you when they reach the sides of the screen. If you hit an invader, it dies. If your base gets hit, you lose it. If the invaders reach the bottom of the screen, it's an instant game over, no more lives, that's it, all your base are belong to them. After you take a certain number of shots, a UFO appears overhead
and if you shoot it down you get bonus points, anywhere from 50 to 300, which is a lot considering the point scaling of the game. An extra life typically requires 1500 points, but shooting down invaders ranges from 10 to 30. The secret of the UFO is that the point value cycles through a list depending on how many shots you fire. It's a 15-shot loop, and people have been known to abuse the pattern for maximum points. Now those barricades? You can indeed hide behind them, but they are destructible both by enemy fire and by your own. So you have to be careful with them and use them wisely. Now you may notice that as you thin the invading herd, the remaining aliens will get faster. This is one of the first examples of a difficulty curve, and the funny thing is that it happened by accident. You see, Nishikado had trouble programming the game as he wanted, but he did notice that the control processor was able to render the enemy's animations faster when fewer enemies were on screen. So he decided, screw it, and kept it in as a means to make the game more challenging.
Sometimes the best things in life are the ones we don't expect.
Now, being such an early game, Space Invaders was a huge innovator for the genre and the medium as a whole. It was the first game in which enemies could fire back, and one of the first games to incorporate a live system and the idea of stages in games, instead of having a fixed length of time per play which other games at the time incorporated. This was also the game which introduced the concept of high scores, something which endures to this day. You know about online leaderboards, right? These would become norms for games, and the barriers would even serve as the first ever cover system in a game. Another innovation that Space Invaders made was being the first game to incorporate an in-game soundtrack. You heard it at the beginning, and retro gamers probably have it drilled into their subconscious. It's just a simple 4-note bass line, but it plays throughout the game like an electronic heartbeat. At times it even seems to synchronize with the Invaders' death march, almost like it's heralding the inevitable. And what's more, the music's tempo increases as more enemies are destroyed, further increasing the tension. It's such a simple idea, but it had such a huge impact on the medium going forward. Of course, given the technology at the time, some corners needed to be cut. The most prominent example being in the display. On some cabinets, you may find the game projected onto a moon backdrop via a hidden monitor and two-way mirror setup. However, the earliest cabinets had to resort to more crude methods to show color. Cellophane. That's right, the earliest versions of the game had black and white graphics overlaid with colored strips of cellophane to give the illusion of color. Laugh at it all you want, but this is how shit got done in the early days. And later ports of the game had actual color, so it's all good there. Funny thing, when Nishikado completed the game, it was initially greeted with a mixed reception from both Taito's staff and arcade owners. While his co-workers really liked the game, the higher-ups figured the game wouldn't sell well due to the live-based nature of the game as opposed to the fixed timer model. The main initial buyers for the game were bowling alleys and pachinko parlors. There were over 100,000 units installed in Japan alone by the end of the year, grossing over $670 million. In 1978, that equates to over $2.8 billion when adjusted for inflation. And by the end of 1979, that number ballooned to over 750,000 units installed worldwide. And by 1982, the game had grossed over $3.8 billion, which in today's dollars would be $11.8 billion. Hell, there were some arcades that were packed with nothing but Space Invaders. The game turned out to be so popular that there were rumors that it was causing a shortage of 100 yen coins.
Of course, those rumors don't hold up under scrutiny, but it's fun to consider.
Of course, a game this successful would inspire a lot of people. Among the people inspired by Space Invaders are some of the biggest names in the industry, including Shigeru Miyamoto, Satoshi Tajiri, Hideo Kojima, and John Romero. And it wasn't just a success in arcades. The Atari 2600 port of the game is credited with being the first killer app for a console, quadrupling the sales of the console and totaling over 6.2 million cartridges sold by 1990. Now that is what I call successful. And for what it did for gaming, it deserves it. And like I've said before, with success comes sequels. And there are plenty. Let's go over the arcade sequels and a few of the console and handheld ones as well. Let's start with Space Invaders Part 2, which was released in the middle of 1979 in Japan and January of 1980 in the US as Space Invaders Deluxe. This is a rather incremental sequel including minor new elements, such as UFOs that can become momentarily invulnerable, some that can deploy more invaders, and some invaders that split into two when shot. This game also included rudimentary cutscenes between levels, kind of a precursor to Pac-Man's cutscenes. The game was actually designed to clear out excess arcade boards. Now, this is not to be confused with Space Invaders 2, released exclusively in America by Midway in 1980, in a cocktail...
Don't laugh! I see you.
Anyways, this variant had a 2-player head-to-head mode for competitive play. An interesting approach. 1984 saw the release of Return of the Invaders, and the advance in technology was clear from the appearance of the graphics alone. Aside from that, the game, developed by a company called UPL, included more advanced movement and attack patterns from the enemies, and a more powerful ship for you. If you left certain enemies until the end, you could enter a bonus stage where you could earn huge points by destroying a mothership. Fast forward to 1990, and Majestic 12, The Space Invaders Part 4, later released to home computers as Super Space Invaders 91. This game included new power-ups, player ships that took multiple hits, various zones, and new variations on enemy behavior, including powerful boss invaders. 1990 also had an odd minigame called Minivaders, but the next main title came in 1994 as a remake of the original called Space Invaders DX. Aside from a port of the original, there was also a parody mode, which included characters from other Taito games like Bubble Bobble, Arkanoid, and more, as well as a versus mode for 2 players. Now, from here on out, the arcade titles veer into the unusual territory, the first being outright parody. Starting with Space Invaders 95, the attack of lunar loonies, known as Akan Vader in Japan. It takes the gameplay of the original game and throws a coat of Saturday morning paint all over it. I mean the entire can. Take off the lid, splatter all the paint, and use what's left to power an Amiga CD32. It also features charge shots, bonus stages, and off-the-wall bosses. Plus, there are cameos from Pocky and Rocky, as well as the Silverhawk from the Darius series. From there, we'll have to skip several years. Don't worry, I'll cover the console games we skipped. And in 2008, as part of the game's 30th anniversary, Taito released Space Invaders The Beat Attacker, a rhythm-based game in which you stepped on beat pads to defeat the approaching invaders. Up to 3 players could play, and the game continued until the invaders reached the bottom. Oh, and this was part of the trend of ticket redemption games. Flash forward up to 2016, and Rothrails and Taito gave us another arcade-exclusive take called Space Invaders Frenzy. In this one, players used seat-mounted blasters to destroy wave upon wave of invaders. This one had both redemption and non-redemption variants. Finally, in 2020, the most recent arcade-only experience, Space Invaders Counterattack. This was a game played seated using a cannon that fires little balls. Thankfully, the chamber is well contained, so you won't have to worry about...
The balls are gone!
So not only are you firing balls at the screen, but there are also some rounds where you fire at physical figures of invaders to push them back so that you don't get a game over. And just like Frenzy, there are both redemption and amusement-only versions. If you can find any around, that is.
Now that pretty much covers the arcade games, but now let's look at most of the console and handheld ones. I'll stick to the ones that aren't simple ports.
Let's start in 1990, when Space Invaders Fukatsu no Hi was released for the PC Engine in Japan. This game gave enemies more complex shot patterns, but also gave you the chance to earn various power-ups. However, this game also took away your barricades. That same year, Space Invaders 90 was released for the Mega Drive in Japan, later to be released the following year in North America as Space Invaders 91. The game itself was a similar deal to Fukatsu no Hi, except this one had an international release. In 1999, the game had something of a reboot, which was developed for PS1, N64, Game Boy Color, and PC. This version had similar features to the other console exclusives, but had 3D-style graphics, along with both co-op and versus modes, and it was published by... Okay, to be fair, this was from before the days when Activision was known to be a toxic cesspit of horrible working conditions and terrible business decisions. In 2002, Taito tried to reboot the series as a third-person shooter for some reason, in the form of Space Raiders, known in Japan as Space Invaders Invasion Day. Needless to say, it bombed. Now in 2005, Taito developed 2 different games, one for PSP called Space Invaders Evolution, and one for DS called Space Invaders Revolution. Evolution was released in Japan and Europe, but not America. It had the original game, a versus game, and Future, which had rhythm-based elements and looked like... this. Revolution included the original game and a new era mode, which had a lot of different invader types and a few different types of power-ups. In 2008, Taito released Space Invaders Extreme for the DS and PSP for the series' 30th anniversary. This title ran on color and music, including rhythm-based elements and bonuses based on things like color, row, column, and more. It got a sequel on the DS the following year, which used both of the screens of the DS. Also in 2008, Taito released possibly the strangest of the series, Space Invaders Get Even, in which you control the UFO to deploy invaders to attack Earth. It had a piecewise release with the base game and several DLC levels, but it was released on WiiWare, which means you can't even buy it officially anymore.
Which means your only hope of playing it now is... well... yeah, no.
Now the last two games I want to talk about are the most interesting of the lot. The first is Space Invaders Infinity Gene. Originally released on iOS in 2009, it was later ported to PS3 and Xbox 360 the following year, which is how I played it. At first, it seems like the original. But no sooner do you clear first wave, than a quote from Charles Darwin about evolution appears on the screen. This is the tone for the game's whole theme. Evolution. Your ship starts no better than the original ship, but you can evolve its abilities by obtaining genes.
No, you can't have my genes. They will remain on my legs, thank you very much.
These evolutions include free movement, new types of weapons, new stages, and other content. You can also power up your weapon by obtaining neurons from UFOs, and even gain extra points from chaining together enemy kills and passing through enemy fire in the instant before it becomes dangerous. There's also a music mode where levels are generated based on your music tracks. That's pretty damn cool. The other of these two is literally the biggest Space Invaders game ever. Space Invaders Gigamax. This was first unveiled in 2018 to celebrate the series' 40th anniversary. It was a game originally so big that no console could possibly hold it. It was reserved for special events because it was literally projected onto the walls of a building at the Lagunasia theme park at Laguna Tenbosch in Gamagori City in Japan. Up to 10 players could play at once during the event, which is why such a huge projection was needed. It was crazy. And there was even an event with a 20-player version at one point at Huis Tenbosch in Sasebo, Japan. Obviously, something this big was not going to come to consoles without being scaled back considerably. So, when it eventually came to the Space Invaders Invincible Collection and Space Invaders Forever, they made it a 4-player game. Well, that's Space Invaders for you. It's amazing that such a simple concept could inspire so many variations, but with all the innovations it either created or popularized, it's little surprise that the game has left such a lasting legacy. To this day, it's still considered to be one of the first real blockbusters in gaming, as well as one of the most influential games in history. When a game is this revolutionary and inspires so much that we take for granted today, of course people are going to remember it for years to come. Without it, gaming probably wouldn't be the same. Oh, and by the way, you might not know this, but there's a new Puzzle Bobble / Bust-A-Move game coming out this year. Why do I bring this up in a video about Space Invaders? Well, it's quite simple, really. The game includes a crossover with Space Invaders. Make of that what you will.
Of course, even in an era in which even 2D games have shown mind-blowing advancement, it's important to know where things came from. By understanding the past, it helps us appreciate the present that much more. Unfortunately, it won't help us deal with a real-life alien invasion. Real life isn't like Futurama, you know. I'm the Quarter Guy, and until next time, the arcade is closed.
Any Zelda fan knows the 3 elements of the Triforce: power, wisdom, and courage. And as we all know, adventurers in Hyrule need all 3 of these elements. Power to make it through the toughest of dungeons in a Zelda game, wisdom to recognize when a dungeon is just bad, and courage to deal with it anyway because you just know there's something better at the other end, right? Right? Next time, Top 10 Worst Legend of Zelda Dungeons. It's game time! Hey everyone, QG here. If you enjoyed the video, please like, subscribe, leave a comment, and share the video around. Feel free to check out my Twitter and my Twitch streams, and consider supporting me through Patreon, and donating to my Extra Life campaign to support Children's Wisconsin. Thanks for watching.